I started this series with three stories I wanted to tell. North's entrance into the VFL, the mad run North had in the 1970s, and the mess the club finds itself in now, in 2025. But, to bridge the gap between these stories, we have to hike up our trouser legs and wade through the putrid waters of the losing years. A 45-year period where North looked about as competitive as a snail at the Monaco Grand Prix. So, let's just get it over with. North Melbourne lost their first VFL hang on, they actually won? Against Geelong, a side who would lose 2 other games for the whole year. Holy hell. They wouldn't win another game for a month and only another 3 for the rest of 1925. Their return fixture against Geelong was a disaster for 2 reasons. Firstly, they lost by nearly 100 points, which was an absolute rarity outside of St Kilda games back then. And secondly, there was a massive brawl. Sparked by Fred Rutley throwing a round-arm haymaker at that year's leading goal kicker, Lloyd Hagger, the brawl involved trainers and left 2 Geelong players unconscious, including captain Cliff Rankin. Rutley faced 6 charges at the tribunal, appropriately enough for a club named the Shinboners. 2 of them were for kicking, and the league president said it was the worst case he'd ever presided over. Rutley was banned for life. The ban was overturned 5 years later, allowing Rutley a very brief return, but the time served, 89 games, is the 3rd longest suspension in league history and the longest for on-field offences. The Shinboners failed to stabilise after that, ending their debut season with a 5-12 record, a win rate of 29.4%. It got so bad, some fans literally offered to give their players the kiss of life. One female fan invaded the ground during a monumental loss to Essendon to help revive a fallen player. Yet, to this day, the 1925 season only barely cracks the top 30 worst years North have had, which tells you how bad this is going to get. North would only have 4 better seasons than that across the next 20 years. They came last 8 times. It took a world war for this team, admitted to the league in 1925 with this record in the VFA, to have a single winning season. Their streak of 19 losing seasons from their inception isn't just the longest such streak from inception for any VFL-AFL team, it's the longest in the league's history outright, tied with only the Invisible Men era St Kilda, which, as we've established, was a pretty horrid team in its own right. Let's track their ELO. North joined the VFL with an ELO of 1120, good for 4th best in the VFA, but below average for the VFL thanks to the high ELO of most of its initial entrants. How you doing, St Kilda? By the end of 1925, it had fallen to 1069. Nice, but not a terrible opening season. Other clubs have had way worse. But after a 1926 in which a single draw was their best result, it had plummeted to 931, comfortably worst in the league. It spiked in 1927 when they were even top of the table after round 4, but a loss streak of 15 lowered it to 895. They were now neck and neck with Hawthorn in a race to bedrock. 1928 brought a highlight. Cheered on by those in Arden Street's new 2,000-seat brick stand, Leo Dwyer came 3rd in the Brownlow Medal, the VFL's new league best and fairest. Then, the Depression began. First, it was emotional, with another 17-loss season in 1929. Then, it was monetary, as the Roaring Twenties stopped and the Great Depression took hold. Dwyer was one of 7 players to leave before 1930, mainly due to monetary reasons, as it was hard to land players a day-to-day job in the heavily industrial North area. 1930 was terrible. 1 win against St Kilda, so it barely counted. Even then, it was an odd performance. After a 9-goal second term erased a 26-point quarter-time deficit, the Roos were held goalless in the 3rd term before scraping over the line to victory. It got so bad that for the first time since university went to the great football ground in the sky, we had a club ELO start with a 7. The club was £360 in debt, and to make matters worse, 3 key figures had just passed away. Firstly, Alf Woodham. If you'll remember, he was a key figure as a former secretary, player, and even vice president of the club, having given decades of service. The second was Andy Curran, mastermind behind the recruitment wave that led North into the 1910s and turned it into a superpower. And, finally, Sid Barker, their champion captain of that era. Yes, he'd left for Essendon, but upon hearing North had been revived, he tried to come back. The Permits Board wouldn't allow it. After skippering Essendon to 2 flags alongside Charlie Hardy, he did come back in 1927 to captain North and then coached once injuries ended his career. A fireman when not playing footy, he died suddenly, way too early, at the age of 42. It would be difficult to find a way for things to get worse from here. And in 1931, it got worse. In 1931, North were particularly hopeless. They were still financially crippled. Geelong actually donated their share of gate takings to North in their Arden Street fixture. In a time where scoring was generally low, with the average being around 76 per team per game, North conceded nearly 110 points for every time they limped out on field, almost double what they would score. This is good for the 17th worst percentage to 2024, with only 4 sides lower than that mark since World War II. They failed to win a game, the first winless VFL side since 1914 University. In fact, of the 13 winless seasons in league history, of course St Kilda have an outsized percentage of them, but 3 of them are owned by losing years North Melbourne. Even Hawthorn, who strung together 18 consecutive losing seasons of their own in this period, only had 1 winless run. North's next win was in round 3, 1932, ending a 33-game losing streak, the 4th highest in league history behind University, of course, 1890 St Kilda, of course, and North Melbourne's winless run from round 18, 1933 to round 17, 1935. 1932 saw North celebrate the end of their losing streak by becoming competent, authoring their 2 best seasons yet and finishing in single-digit positions for the first time in the VFL. After belting Hawthorn in the penultimate game of 1933, they then decide to drop 35 games in a row, with their win to snap the streak a 7-point squeaker over an inaccurate 2-win Footscray outfit. By now, their ELO rating was in the 760s, even after having picked up a bit for that 1932 season, even getting in a 4-digit number. This is dreadful levels of incompetence. Seriously, only University and St Kilda have ever really been that low for prolonged periods. Let's break things up with a fashion show. North left the VFA looking suspiciously like Carlton, their wardrobe having not recovered from the crime that was the 1908 jersey. They'd have to change upon entering the VFL, but instead of their OG jersey, they wore this. That actually looks pretty good. Nicknamed the Bluebirds at the time, this actually fit quite well. Plus, the white yoke kinda looked like the Big V if you squinted and ignored the fact that they were committing footballing atrocities. Thankfully, in 1933, the club successfully applied to be able to wear the blue and white stripes, which remained their home jersey, with some alterations of course, until 2020, when apparently their jersey department got dementia for a couple of years. Thankfully they fixed that, and there were no other controversial jerseys in North Melbourne's history. But where were we? Oh yes, 1935. The club's debts have mounted to £1,200, so they ran to the VFL for some help. They said that if the committee raised £500, the league would give them an interest-free loan for the same amount, which they managed to pull off, albeit by taking out an overdraft, which is essentially cheating. That same year, ticket sales dropped by £407. Yikes! However, in 1936, they were able to convince the council to overtake the financial responsibility for that new brick grandstand, allowing them to pay off the debts all the sooner. New coach Paddy Scanlon had turned the club's fortunes around, at least a bit, with the club earning 5 wins, including the best win of their first 20 years against their old VFA rival Footscray. In 1937, North finally instituted a Best and Fairest award, instantly naming it after their hero of the 1910s, Sid Barker. Wally Carter was its first recipient in a year where he was basically the only one left standing. Scanlon resigned, the captain in Charlie Gaudion hurt his leg so bad he had to retire, one of 5 serious injuries from that game alone, and the club limped to 3 wins, quite literally. In comes Frank Trainer. Not to be confused with Frank Trainer, a member of the Fable Singers who was responsible for this absolute beat. Frank Trainer had just finished up a stint in charge at Northcote, but was reluctant to join another club. After some pestering, he joined North, which began a long and illustrious partnership between family and club. Under his leadership and the astute coaching of Bob McCaskill, players such as Sel Murray, Sid Dyer, Jock Cordner and Ted Morecambe began to blossom and dragged North slowly but surely up the ladder. In fact, it was all a bit weird. North was still kinda hopeless, and it took the world falling apart for them to finally put things together. Well, in a way, at least. Sal Murray, who just kicked 78 goals in 1939, was one of 15 North players who left the club to enlist in World War II Electric Boogaloo, so 1940 was a wash. However, he returned in 1941 to kick a club record 88, only one short of the leading goal kicker prize, with North rising to 9th. However, once again, their skipper retired due to injury, this time it was Cordner. The next year, North became the masters of their own destiny, with Trainer snapping up the lease rights to Arden Street. This, combined with regaining soldiers from the war, gently rose them up the ladder, especially once Sid Dyer came back.
But others weren't so lucky. This includes Len Thomas, a former South Melbourne Premiership hero who ended his playing days as a playing coach for North. Thomas had the option not to go as he was older than the general age of soldiers being recruited. Len didn't see it that way. A fellow just can't be out of a thing like this, he quipped. So he left North halfway through his only season there, but was killed in action in 1943. George Brock had been a Premiership player at Port Adelaide, crossing over in 1941 and playing his debut with head injury sustained in a car crash. He was tough as they come. He played 4 games before being killed in a training accident that year. Len Johnson, Essendon's 1929 leading goal kicker, had joined North in 1933. He was also killed in an accident long after his North tenure ended, this time a warehouse wall falling in on him in an act of ineptitude by the ADF that was just completely preventable. Alf Goonan had played in that first game against Geelong in 1925, scoring North's first VFL point. He was wounded in British Malaya and died a victim of the Parry Soolong massacre. Bert Peters played 17 games at the start of the 1930s, losing every single one. One of his final games was a 168-point thrashing at the hands of Richmond, still the Tigers' biggest win and North's biggest loss. Doug Strang, in only his second game playing that day, kicked 14 goals. Wow. Anyway, Peters, well, unfortunately he was shot down by a U-boat over the Bay of Biscayne in 1944. Beres Riley, he was a journeyman playing for 3 different sides, but he started at North. A good mate of Melbourne's, Bluey Truscott, in their time together at Melbourne and the RAAF, he met a similar fate, downed in Crete, dying in the crash in 1943. Finally, Mo Shapir. At 164 centimetres, he's one of the shortest players North ever fielded, although he still looked like Aaron Sandilands compared to little Charlie Hardy. Mo played 3 times in 1935. His bomber went missing in Egypt in 1942. He, his crew and his plane were never found. A main reason why I'm delving so deeply into North's lost soldiers is that for a club who'd been around the VFL for such a short while, they've been very heavily involved in the war effort. North list 192 of their former players as serving in World War II and having played for North in the VFL. 192! To the end of 1945, 352 people had played in the VFL for North. By the numbers, 54.54% of all North's players in these 20 years served in the war. To get all but 7 of them back when the death toll was in the tens of millions was phenomenal. Some of these men who came back would prove to be pivotal names going forward. Without them, North wouldn't be the club it is today and may not even be alive. which is why it's worth mentioning the sacrifices of the men who didn't make it back.
North also suffered two rather unusual losses during this time. Jim Stewart in 1941 just came off his best season yet. He just won North's Most Consistent Player award after playing 16 games in 1941, the 24-year-old entering the prime of his career. Unfortunately, he wouldn't play another game as he passed away due to appendicitis before the 1942 season kicked off. Then Jack Allister, North's 1942 best and fairest, passed away from pneumonia at the age of 27 before the 1946 season commenced. 1944 rolled around and North finally did it. After 19 years, they registered their first winning season, only just scraping over the line with a 10-8 record, good for 6th place. They would build on this the next year, making their first final series, finishing 3rd. Their first final would be against 4th placed Carlton, with nearly 55,000 people cramming into Princes Park to watch history. Unfortunately, Sel Murray had transferred to Richmond that year, and oh boy could North have really used him on this day. Carlton waltzed into quarter time having scored 5 goals to nothing, with North hitting three-quarter time having scored 2 goals 13. This one was never close, and it gave Carlton an easy path to the grand final, which they ended up winning. North would win 2 premierships in the next 2 years, but they were the Colts and the reserves, so no one really cared that much. With the war now over and clubs now fielding actual full 18s, North tumbled back down the ladder. Yes, that's more familiar territory. This was the end for Bob McCaskill, who was undoubtedly a talented coach, but there's only so much that can be done with this mess. To be fair, McCaskill did orchestrate a ridiculous halftime comeback in May of 1947, something that North did like to dabble in, but consistency, well, that wasn't North's bag, not yet. In comes Wally Carter. If you remember him, he was North's first best and fairest. He had form, having done the coaching in both of those lower grade flags that I mentioned. North won 8 games in 1948 and had some promising moments, but there was nothing worth getting concerned about if you were an opponent, especially when Collingwood dismantled them in round 1 of 1949, to the tune of 50 points. A loss against the Bombers left them at 0-2. Carter then decided to play the kids and promptly won the next 5 in a row. From there, North kept pace with Carlton at the top, both fighting for the minor premiership. Round 19, the final game. North and Carlton are tied on 13 wins. And guess who's playing each other? Arden Street hosted 35,116 people, a crowd that would never be beaten at the venue as people flocked to witness their group of whipping boys take on one of the VFL's power teams. It was set to be an amazing battle, but in reality, it was never close. North smashed them. In one of the closest seasons of all time, where every finalist was separated by 1 win, North topped them all, their first VFL minor premiership. However, with the new McIntyre system, a grand final berth was not assured, no right of replay for the minor premier. Instead, they'd get a second chance if they lost, which they did, to Carlton after leading at the final change. Well done, boys. Essendon hosted North in a preliminary final and led all day. North's finals record slipped to 0-3, and although they'd announced themselves as contenders at last, they weren't the genuine article. Not yet. 1950 would be the biggest year for North in the VFL so far, for 2 reasons. Firstly, they'd finally found their identity. They'd been known as the Bluebirds for a while, but that name didn't seem to resonate. They then took the Shinbone as nickname thanks to their rough and tile style of play, hi again to Fred Rutley, but this was more of an adopted anachronism than an official real nickname. As clubs began changing their nicknames from the 1920s through to the 1940s to more aggressive fare, North began to look at themselves. What was a proud, fierce, uniquely Australian symbol that they could adopt? No, that's too silly. No, that one doesn't exist yet. No. Yes, that's the one. Yeah, 1950 was the first year that North adopted the Kangaroos moniker. And the second reason why 1950 was such a big year, well, North kept winning. 13 times actually, including 7 on the trot to finish second to the John Coleman-led Bombers, and it was those Bombers that North had to face in their 4th final. Sadly, the first term was a familiar story. Completely outclassed, the Roos stared down the barrel of a 32-point gap in the first half an hour. However, North began clawing back at the deficit after Dynan was moved to the ruck. A 5-goal second term helped North chew away the deficit, with the sides going pretty much goal for goal thereafter. North hit the lead through Marchese late in the game, but then it happened. About 30 seconds to go. North backline. Jock McCorkle, North's fullback, was dealing with a bouncing ball near the boundary and decided to keep the ball alive while John freaking Coleman was in his vicinity. Of course, Coleman outclassed him as he did to everyone, passed the ball to his teammate McEwen, who put Essendon in front. Bang. Game over. It had happened again. North had figured out how to lose a final with mere seconds to go. Quarter time, preliminary final, North are down by 39 points in a complete shellacking. This does not look like a team on the rise. Instead, this looks very much like a team that's lost its last 4 games and never won a VFL final. Wally Carter throws magnets around the board and North somehow both strangles the Geelong attack while pegging back chances of their own. But in an 11-shot-to-2 second term, North wasted their chances, still 20 points down at the half, with Geelong having the wind at their backs for the third. And here's where I introduce you to Les Foot. Despite having a body part for a surname, Les was already a North hero. Named the captain the prior year, he celebrated that by winning the club's best and fairest, his second award. Foot was unbelievable. He could kick with either foot and find targets with a high accuracy. He was a fantastic mark despite being a shade under 6 foot and could really play anywhere. He was best in traffic, having a blind turn that could rival Dustin Martin. In fact, his favourite trick was to take a mark, usually a good one, and then sell some filthy foot candy to the man on the mark by pretending to kick and then running around him, taking a bounce and gaining extra metres before his kick. Touching back on that 1947 comeback, Foot was at the heart of it. He placed himself in the ruck for the final term and North promptly kicked 52 points to 0 against John Coleman-era Essendon thanks to his ruck dominance against 3 players who were all taller than him. He'd done it again in the semi-final this year, willing his team back from that horror start even though they didn't get across the line. And now against Geelong, he'd do it again, but not quite in the way you'd expect. He took a position in the forward pocket and would become a link man between the midfield and attack. His opponent didn't follow him up the ground, staying back in the pocket, double-teaming Jock Spencer, North's power forward, who'd kicked 78 goals before today. It left Foot free, whose aimbot passing would have found Spencer even if Geelong had put their whole team on to guard him. North kicked 4 goals in the space of 6 minutes in the third term, 3 of which were through Spencer thanks to passes from Les Foot. The defence held their own, only allowing 4 further Geelong majors, leaving Marchese, Rob and Spencer the job of just scoring more than that. They succeeded, and North not only had registered their first win in a VFL final, but they'd also booked their first ticket to the big dance since joining the league. The big day was here. So many fans were baying for entry into the MCG that the Department of Health had to close the gates, fearing for public safety, and the crowd spilled over onto the field, ringing the boundary line. North, having almost beaten Essendon 2 weeks before, would have thought they were ready for a great contest. After describing his great feats, you may think that Les Foot was an equal match, that Jock Spencer, with his 83 goals for the year, was to be the big hero. Well, let me show you how good this Essendon team was. Let's start with the backline and Les Gardner. This is his 14th final, 10 more than North had played as a team to this point. Bill Brittingham was their fullback, only because despite being Essendon's leading goal scorer 2 years in a row, there still wasn't enough room in their forward line for him. He became so good as a fullback, using his experience as a forward to counter forwards, that he came second in this year's Essendon Best and Fairest. Incredible, considering the calibre of this team. Norm MacDonald, Essendon's first Indigenous player, was also back there, a sprinter who had placed second in the 1952 Stawell Gift to another Essendon player. Then we moved to the midfield. He had reliable role players in Collins and McClure, but also Essendon royalty in Bill Hutchinson, a 3-time premiership winner already and a regular fixture in the Brownlow top 10, still a couple of years away from his peak where he won the thing twice in a row, but having a season good enough this year to claim the best and fairest, his third. Then that forward line that Brittingham couldn't crack. You got Jack Jones, a big man who moved like a rover, adept with marking, running and kicking. There were Bert Harper and Ron McEwen, both premiership players already. And then you had the big two. Firstly, the most experienced player in the league, Dick Reynolds. The skipper was winding down his career. The last of his 3 Brownlow medals, although it should have been 2, Button was robbed, was 12 years ago, and the last of his 7 best and fairests was during the war whilst playing as a rover. Now in the forward line, he was still a wily and handy player to have, indeed the best Essendon ever had, although when given that honour, he said that Hutchinson was better. Of course, in my opinion, neither of them are even in the top 3. Albert Thurgood did things no other human could do aside from Big Dave. Matthew Lloyd is the finest goal kicker who has ever walked this earth. And, of course, there's that guy. The guy who this Essendon era is named for. John Coleman. Essendon had a keen interest in Coleman from when he was 18, but back in the 1940s he was considered too young and small. 230 goals in 2 seasons at country level convinced the Bombers to take him aboard aged 20, and he immediately repaid them. No, seriously, immediately. He kicked 12 goals on debut. He wasn't a typical full forward. He was slight of build and used speed and a leaping ability that was out of this world to get his opportunities. He'd lull the fullback into a false sense of security by just kind of standing around, then explode onto a lead. Before you knew it, boom, he's sitting on the centre halfback's head taking a screamer. It's a shame that only 6 minutes of footage exist of Coleman's play, because he would have been an absolute marvel to watch. His 6th goal in the 1949 Grand Final gave him 100 goals in his first season. He's the only man to do that. Of the top 200 goal scorers in the league's history, only 4 have done it within even their first 3 seasons. Coleman took it to another level in 1950, packing away 10 against the Saints and Pies and 11 against the Bloods. His 4 against North last time out took him to 116 for the year. And 1 minute into this grand final, that tally was 117. He was the main target and North did their best to quell him, adding only a behind from his next 2 chances. This, though, just meant that Reynolds was open. Bang, goal, 13-point margin, and in fact, let's do that again. Even despite Coleman knocking himself out trying to get into space, Essendon scored again, this time through Snell, for a 26-point lead. North's first, of course, came through Spencer after a rare mistake from Brittingham, 16 minutes in. This opened the door, though, as Foote, who'd assisted the first goal, of course, sent one in again. Another error, this time from McClure, opened the door, and Kevin Dynan got one back. Essendon got lucky with their 5th, just clearing a pack, before Les Mogg mogged off half the Essendon midfield, allowing Tim Robb to goal. Coleman missed a mark, a rarity, but McEwen finished off the move. However, Brooker was there at the other end to again grab one back for the Roos. The goal-for-goal encounter concluded with a final goal for Essendon, 7 for the term, giving them a 21-point lead. But North had the wind now. Unfortunately, they failed to make the most of it. They kept Essendon to 3 points for the term, but after another foot pass found Spencer for a goal, their next 5 shots all missed. The half-time gap was 13 points. It should have been less. A key change now was Foote going back down to cover Reynolds, leaving North naked in the midfield. Hugh Hutchinson breaking free, and despite the kick going a bit haywire, it found Coleman, who goaled, opening the third term scoring. Dynan got his own back with a pass to Robb, who scored. The rain now really began to fall in earnest, which allowed the game to get a bit rough. North played the man rather than the ball, trying to fell Essendon's titanic names. They failed to take advantage as Rob missed 2 chances. Hutchinson got a goal of his own, but Spencer pulled one back from the goal square. 3 big chances rounded out the term. For North, Spencer missed from close range, but on a tight angle. For Essendon, the term was rounded out by a touched Harper shot, but before that, their hero stepped up to the plate. Coleman had a free kick from the boundary, some 60 yards out, in the rain. Impossible for an ordinary man. Coleman, though, was no ordinary man. His 3rd goal sent Essendon into the last change 20 points up, although they'd forfeit the slight breeze advantage. Foot went up front in the final term trying to recapture last week's magic, but it was of no use. Jock McCorkle, North fullback, took a mark but copped a whack. Foolishly, he turned around and round-armed the offender, Albert Harper. This resulted in a free to Harper at close range and the goal that ended the contest. Essendon would win by 38 points, with Coleman chipping in his 120th goal, a mark no one would match for 18 years, well after his premature retirement at the age of 25. There was an expectation that North would continue to carry this form throughout the next few years, keep competing for flags, maybe even winning one. Instead, in 1951, they finished 9th. Foot, Mackenzie and Robb subsequently left. Frank Traynor suddenly passed away at the age of 57, leaving a leadership vacuum. And after that awful season, the next one started with 4 of North's players being seriously injured in a car crash. This was more like it. This is where they belonged, what they were used to. Across the rest of the 1950s and the entire 1960s, North would make 2 finals appearances, with the rest being years not really worth talking about. There was 1954, where North had to face a Melbourne Empire and maybe should have won, but fell away late. In 1958, they even surprised Fitzroy to narrowly win a final in literally the last minute, before bowing out to the Pies in a match that was never really close. 3 years later, they were 11th, again, right as Hawthorn, a side who registered the league's last winless season when North were in that grand final, were lifting up their first Premiership Cup. Footscray, that other team who joined the league in 1925, they'd lost that grand final, but were unlucky not to add to their 1954 triumph. When St Kilda lost the 1965 decider and managed to accident their way to the 1966 flag, North's combined win tally across those seasons was less than either of St Kilda's home and away showings. North were the bottom feeders now, the only team without a premiership after 40 years of trying. They'd made 1 grand final and been belted in it. No one talked about them. At least the Invisible Men era Saints did weird, funny shit and had some guys winning Brownlows. This book lists all the big and fun stories that happened in the league's first 100 years. The team that gets mentioned the least of all the Victorian clubs, by far, is North Melbourne. There were no individual honours either. The only highlight was Laurie Dwyer doing what his dad Leo did and coming 3rd in the Brownlow in 1960 before going 1 better the next year. All North had was their precious home at Arden Street, the ground that had served as their ticket into the VFL, complete with a resplendent, giant cardboard kangaroo for some reason. The Kangaroos had been a ground that happened to come with a team attached. And in 1964, they were about to lose that ground.
Since securing their ground lease, North's relationship with the council had soured. 1964's attempt to renegotiate the lease agreement went poorly. North approached the neighbouring Broadmeadows Council to see if they could set up a new admin HQ there, but to no avail. The city of Coburg had their ear to the ground. They had a VFA team based in the area. If you remember, it was the very team whose admission led to the association setting off the trail of dominoes that allowed North to be in this position in the first place. But they could see that the VFL was by far the bigger draw and wanted some of that action. They offered an irresistible deal, favourable lease conditions as well as a £75,000 grandstand with another £25,000 worth of development, all to be completed by the start of the 1967 season, all paid for by the council. It was a move that North felt they had to make. Low membership combined with the fact that North had higher away crowds than home crowds meant gate receipts were a fraction of other teams. Hell, St Kilda's home attendance was almost double what North's was after they'd moved to Moorabbin in 1965. Fittingly, 1965 would also be the year that North moved into Coburg City Oval. But there were difficulties with this new plan. North's secretary decided that this was the perfect time to resign, leaving his successor in the lurch. 8 days after his appointment, North made their Coburg debut. The weather was abysmal. Only 13,774 people turned up to see a dreadful game in which South Melbourne ruined the opening party with a 10-point victory. It was July by the time North managed to win at their new home deck, by which point the season was over. Just over 8,000 turned up that day, which is more remembered for the sacking of Norm Smith than anything that the Roos did. North were able to close out the season in a richer vein of form, but their ground was so poor in the wet that it was given the name of the Everglades. A Night Series premiership and a Brownlow for North's captain Noel Teasdale were highlights, in that neither of those wins really counted for anything, technically at least. The Coburg VFA team had also taken issue with having to ground share. By the end of 1965, they'd taken to playing their home games at Port Melbourne out of protest. This had gotten so bad that it actually affected local council elections, with the councillors that had brought North to Coburg voted out for VFA sympathisers. A large group of North fans also held a public meeting begging North to return to their previous home. However, it was impossible, or at least it seemed so. North and the city of Coburg had signed a 6-year deal, with neither wanting to be the one to break it. They sat down for a meeting on the 28th of September 1965, where it was revealed that Coburg actually had no way of paying for that new grandstand they promised. The deal was mutually terminated. North quickly crawled back to the Melbourne City Council and hammered out a deal to return to Arden Street by early November. All that was needed was member approval at the AGM, which the fans had shown all year that they wanted. Simple enough, right?
Well, no, as it turns out. Two club vice presidents did a Benedict Arnold at the last minute, preferring that North move to Junction Oval, which St Kilda had recently escaped from. It actually made some level of sense. The cricket club had spent 1965 realising that footy actually brought them in a lot of money, especially as they'd held all the cards in their co-tenancy with the Saints. So their offer to North offered way more favourable conditions. The president, Tony Traynor, son of Frank, magnanimously allowed A.V. Tobin to argue his case for Junction Oval. Tobin lost. Badly. The Junction Oval duo then resigned in disgrace, and North moved back to their proper home, Arden Street. North got more good news in 1967. Country zoning had been introduced, and thanks to being utter dog shit for most of their VFL life, North got given the Ovens and Murray region, among others. The O&M League was considered among the best, and it would give North some absolute gems over the next 20 years. Former Saints coach Alan Killigrew had just left, but he'd just won his second straight Night Series flag, so things were still looking pretty decent. Unfortunately, 1967 was a disaster in terms of injuries, with four-time Sid Barker Memorial Trophy winner Noel Teasdale leaving at the end of that year to transfer to Woodville, maybe the only top-level team in Australia that was worse than North. They sank back down to last, with Spoons in 1968 and 1970, with that middle year being their centenary year. That got spoiled instead by allegations of improper recruitment, which turned out to be a farce, and kind of ironic when you consider what happens in about 5 years' time. If they just curled up and died at this point, I don't think anyone would have blamed them. Instead, three pivotal figures came along who would help turn the fortunes of the club around. They weren't the driving piece, that would come a bit later, but they gave North a foundation to build on. The first was a young fella whose name you might know now for different reasons. Yes, while Sam Kekovich may have spent the 2000s and 2010s as one of multiple high-profile Sams who became meat salesmen on TV, he rose to prominence in 1968 as one of North's first recruits from their country zone. They'd snatched him out from under Carlton's grasp, where his older brother played. So I guess you're missing out on all of these premierships, Sam. Man, it'd be nice to bring that coach to North. So yeah, while Carlton were lifting up one of these, Sam only played in one win, but despite that he mustered 6 Brownlow votes, scored a goal per game and averaged 19 touches at only the age of 19. The next year, well, his disposal output stays the same, but his goal scoring quadruples. He gets 12 Brownlow votes for his trouble despite giving away 61 free kicks, one more than 2024 league leader Brodie Grundy, who played 10 more games. In terms of average frees though, Sam barely cracked the top 10. Umpiring used to be so much worse. Anyway, everyone, aside from the umpires probably, loved Slammin' Sam, who was seen as the heir apparent to Ted Whitten himself.
Who's your favourite player of all time?
Sam Kekovich.
Oh, excellent choice, the lamb salesman himself. So, what was he like to watch play? Because he just seems like the sort of player who just was a highlight package walking.
My uncle was a Foundation Life member, and we used to get grandstand tickets at North Melbourne, the old Arden Street. North were getting killed. Bottom of the ladder, Kekovich would run down the wing, bounce the ball half a dozen times and kick a point. And the stand was still rocking 5 minutes later. That's how bad.
The second key figure was added in 1970 and is considerably more problematic. He was an absolute legend, yes, winning multiple Sandover medals in WA. He was a fantastically gifted player whose very nature of being held in such high regard for his disposal accuracy, pace and tenacity successfully hid the fact that he was a monster. The football world doesn't know now what to make of Barry Cable, but in the 70s, they sure did. He was a force of nature. And as for the third, well, they find their saviour in a familiar face. A hero had come along at the wrong time originally, as if he'd been born a few years earlier, he may have helped them win the 1950 flag. Alas, he debuted as early as he could in 1952 as a 17-year-old. Small but stocky, the young rover carried the club on his back, becoming its first true VFL icon. He played 220 games, kicking over a goal for each time he played, made the All-Australian team twice, and won 3 consecutive best and fairests. He did his best to push North to finals contention, but when your leading goal kickers only crack 50 thrice in your career, there's only so much you can do. The fans absolutely loved him though. He gave everything he had every time he played. He retired after the 1964 season, but remained a well-loved figure at the club. So much so that at the tender age of 37, North gave him the keys to the whole establishment. From midway through 1971, Alan Aylett was to lead North Melbourne, and he was to lead them to the most phenomenal decade the club would ever see.